following story contains themes of supernatural horror, suspense, and unsettling imagery. It is intended for a mature audience that enjoys folklore and ghost stories. Viewer discretion is advised. The sun was dipping low over the jagged horizon of the Pennsylvania hills, casting long, skeletal shadows across the town of Oakhaven. In these parts, the trees don't just grow. They seem to huddle together as if whispering secrets they've kept since the industrial fires of the last century went cold. It was that peculiar time of evening, the blue hour, when the world feels thin, and the line between what is real and what is remembered begins to blur. Silas sat on the rusted tailgate of a 1998 Chevy, his boots kicking at the loose gravel of the Blackwood Creek overlook. Beside him were Miller and Jax, two locals who had a way of making Silas feel like he was always one step behind. Silas was new to Oakhaven, a quiet soul who had moved there to care for his aging grandfather. He wanted to belong, and in a town this small, belonging usually meant surviving the stories the locals told to test the Flatlanders. "You ever hear why they don't go up to the old foundry after dark?" Miller asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. He lit a cigarette, the orange cherry glowing like a predatory eye in the gathering dusk. Silas shook his head, though a cold prickle of intuition told him he wasn't going to like the answer. "They call him Smashed Face," Miller continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "Back in the 20s, during the Great Depression, a man named Elias worked the heavy presses. One night, the safety chains snapped, or so the company said. A 2-ton iron plate came down. They say his face was flattened like a piece of hammered tin before he even had time to scream. The wind groaned through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and old metal. Silas shifted uncomfortably. He could almost picture it. The screech of metal, the sudden darkness. Miller leaned in closer, the smell of tobacco smoke thick between them. "The thing is, Silas, Elias didn't just die. He stayed. He walks the foundry floor, looking for a face that hasn't been broken. They say if he catches you, he tries to fix his own face by taking yours." Jax chimed in, his voice lighter but no less mocking. "But that's just a story for the kids, right? Unless you're scared of a little bit of history. We were thinking of headed up there tonight. There's an old foreman's box in the main office. Rumor has it there's silver coins in there, left behind during the panic. If you're as brave as you look, maybe you should be the one to go in and grab it." Silas looked toward the dark silhouette of the foundry on the hill. It loomed like a rotting tooth against the purple sky. He knew he should say no. He knew that the pressure in his chest was a warning. But the desire to be more than the new kid, to prove he wasn't the coward they thought he was, weighed heavier than his fear. The woods around them seemed to go silent, as if the birds and the crickets were holding their breath, waiting for his answer. "I'm not scared of an old building," Silas said, though his voice lacked the steel he intended. Miller and Jax exchanged a quick, dark look, a look Silas was too distracted to catch. It wasn't a look of excitement. It was the look of two hunters watching a trap snap shut. The moral of the night was already beginning to take shape, hidden in the shadows of the Appalachian trees. Curiosity is a gift, but when it is fueled by the need for the approval of others, it can lead a man into a darkness from which there is no easy return. Silas stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. The journey to the foundry would take 20 minutes by foot through the Devil's Throat Trail. He didn't know that the Smashed Face wasn't just a legend to scare tourists. He didn't know that some ghosts don't want your soul, they want your identity. "Let's go then," Silas said, stepping off the truck. The gravel crunched loudly under his feet, the only sound in a world that had suddenly become very, very still. The trek toward the old iron foundry felt longer than any mile Silas had ever walked. The trail, known locally as the Devil's Throat, narrowed until the mountain laurel and skeletal oak trees seemed to press in from both sides. The air here was different, colder, and thick with the metallic tang of oxidized iron that had leached into the soil over decades of neglect. Behind him, Miller and Jax walked with a synchronized rhythm, their flashlights cutting erratic arcs through the rising mist. "You're doing great, Silas," Jax said, his voice echoing slightly against the rocky overhangs. "Most guys would have turned back at the creek, but you've got that Oakhaven grit in you after all." The praise felt hollow to Silas, like a bait on a hook, but he nodded anyway, his eyes fixed on the towering silhouette of the foundry ahead. The structure was a jagged monument to a forgotten era, a sprawling complex of brick and corrugated steel that looked like the carcass of a great, dead beast rotting in the moonlight. As they reached the perimeter fence, Miller pulled a heavy set of bolt cutters from his backpack. With a sharp snap, the rusted chain holding the gates fell to the dirt. The sound was unnervingly loud, a gunshot in the silence of the valley. Miller stepped back and gestured toward the yawning darkness of the main entrance. "The foreman's office is right past the central press. That's where the box is. Just grab the silver, come back out, and we'll head to the diner. Drinks are on us." Silas hesitated, his flashlight beam trembling as it hit the "No Trespassing" sign that hung crookedly from the gate. "Why don't we all go in?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Miller chuckled, a dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Rules of the test, kid. One man goes in to face the smashed face. If we all go, the spirit won't show, and the test is void. Besides, someone's got to keep an eye out for the county sheriff. He patrols the ridge this time of night." With a heavy heart and a sense of impending dread, Silas stepped through the gap in the fence. The ground inside the foundry grounds was carpeted in iron slag and broken glass, each step producing a rhythmic crunch slide that seemed to be echoed by the building itself. As he approached the massive, sliding steel doors of the main floor, a sudden, sharp gust of wind blew out from the interior. It didn't smell like the woods. It smelled of stagnant water, old grease, and something scorched, like the scent of a blown fuse. Inside, the foundry was a cathedral of shadows. Massive, silent machines stood like frozen giants, their gears and pistons coated in a century of dust. Silas's flashlight beam was swallowed by the vastness of the space, barely illuminating the path ahead. He reached the center of the floor where the great hydraulic press stood. This was the spot Miller had described, the place where Elias had met his gruesome end. Silas stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. In the silence he heard it, a slow, rhythmic thud-drag, coming from the upper catwalks. The sound was heavy, as if something with a great, uneven weight was moving across the rusted metal gratings high above. Silas turned his light upward, but the beam couldn't reach the ceiling. "Miller? Jax?" he called out, his voice cracking. There was no answer from the gate. He turned back toward the entrance, but the moonlight that had been streaming through the doorway was gone. The heavy steel doors had slid shut, and the faint sound of a padlock clicking into place echoed through the hollow chamber. Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over Silas. He rushed to the door and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Through a small, cracked window in the steel, he saw the faint silhouettes of Miller and Jax retreating toward the woods, their laughter muffled by the thick walls. They hadn't sent him in for a test of courage. They had lured him in for a cruel joke, locking him inside the most haunted site in the county with nothing but a flickering flashlight. The moral of this betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. True character is found in those who stand by you, not those who push you into the fire to see if you'll burn. Silas realized too late that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones hiding in the dark. Sometimes, they are the ones standing right next to you, smiling. As Silas stood with his back to the locked door, the thud-drag sound above him stopped. Then, from the darkness of the foreman's office just 20 feet away, a different sound emerged. It was the sound of a wet, heavy breath being drawn through a throat that had been crushed flat. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, began to detach itself from the wall. The click of the padlock was the finality of a coffin lid closing. Silas stood frozen against the cold, corrugated steel of the foundry doors, his lungs burning with the sharp, recycled air of a tomb. Outside, the world of Pennsylvania woods and moonlight continued to exist, but inside, the rules of the living seemed to have been suspended. The darkness here wasn't just an absence of light. It felt like a physical weight, pressing against his skin with the chill of a winter grave. He hammered his fists against the door, the metal booming like a hollow drum, but he knew it was useless. Miller and Jax were gone, their laughter likely fading into the trees as they headed back to the safety of their homes. Silas was alone in the belly of the beast. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady the beam of his flashlight. He had to find another way out, a loading dock, a window, or a coal chute. But to do that, he had to move deeper into the heart of the ironworks. As Silas stepped away from the door, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't the natural drop of a night breeze. It was a localized, unnatural chill that felt as though it were radiating from the very floorboards. Every breath he exhaled came out in a thick white plume of frost. The silence of the foundry was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of noise, the faint, ghostly ring of hammers and the hiss of steam that seemed to vibrate in the soles of his boots. He navigated his way toward the center of the floor, his light dancing over rusted chains that hung from the ceiling like nooses. He found himself standing before a jagged, wall-mounted mirror in what used to be the workers' washroom. The glass was spider-webbed with cracks, a single impact point at the center having shattered the reflection into 1,000 distorted shards. Silas paused, drawn to his own reflection, but as he looked, his heart skipped a beat. In the fractured glass, his face appeared sliced, shifted, and unrecognizable. A grim foreshadowing of the legend Miller had described. A sudden, sharp clack-clink echoed from the foreman's office nearby. Silas spun around, his light cutting through the gloom. On the floor, a single heavy iron bolt was spinning in a perfect circle, as if someone had just dropped it. It spun with impossible momentum, faster and faster, until it suddenly stopped and stood perfectly upright on its head. Silas backed away, his skin crawling. The laws of physics were beginning to fray at the edges. He stumbled toward a row of wooden lockers, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths. Inside one, he saw a faded, yellowed photograph pinned to the metal. It showed a group of men in soot-stained overalls, smiling stiffly for the camera. In the center stood a tall man with kind eyes and a strong jaw. Beneath the photo, a name was scrawled in charcoal, Elias Thorne. Silas reached out to touch the photo, but as his finger neared the paper, the image began to warp. Elias's face in the photo suddenly flattened, the features blurring into a featureless mask of gray smudge. The moral of this growing dread was clear to Silas in that moment. In the pursuit of belonging, one must never ignore the instinct that whispers of danger. For once the threshold is crossed, the price of curiosity is often paid in pieces of one's own peace. Silas realized he wasn't just in a building. He was in a space where a man's identity had been violently erased, and the air was thick with the hunger to be remembered. A low, grinding sound, like stone being dragged over gravel, erupted from the darkness directly behind him. Silas didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. He felt a presence standing inches from his back. It didn't smell like a person. It smelled like ancient, rusted iron and the copper scent of old blood. A heavy, cold hand, feeling more like a slab of frozen meat than human fingers, came to rest slowly on Silas's shoulder. The touch was not like the warmth of a human hand. It was the crushing weight of a cold, iron slab pressing into Silas's collarbone. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and the air in his lungs turned to shards of ice. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as the world around him began to warp. The beam of his flashlight didn't just flicker. It stretched and bled into a sepia-toned haze. The rusted machines around him began to groan, not with the wind, but with the rhythmic, deafening roar of a factory in full production. Suddenly, Silas was no longer standing in a derelict ruin. The air was thick with the choking soot of coal fires and the blinding heat of molten iron. The year was 1928. Men in flat caps and grease-stained shirts scurried past him like ghosts of a future yet to happen. In the center of the floor stood the great hydraulic press, gleaming and lethal. Beside it stood Elias Thorne, the man from the photograph. He was laughing, wiping sweat from his brow, a man who believed in the honest work of his hands. Silas watched, a silent observer in a window of time, as a man in a fine wool suit, the foreman, approached the press. The foreman's face bore a striking, chilling resemblance to Miller. The man looked at a frayed, sparking cable on the main lift and then at his pocket watch. He knew the machine was failing, but the quota was behind, and the bonuses were at stake. With a look of cold, calculated greed, the foreman stepped back and gave Elias the signal to clear the jammed plate. The sequence happened with a sickening, slow-motion clarity. Elias stepped under the 2-ton iron plate. There was a sound like a gunshot, the safety chain snapping under the strain. Silas tried to shout a warning, to reach out and pull Elias back, but his hands passed through the air like smoke. The iron plate didn't just fall. It plummeted. The crash was a sound of absolute finality, a wet, heavy thud that vibrated through the very foundations of the earth. The factory noise vanished instantly, replaced by a ringing, hollow silence. The vision began to dissolve, but before it faded, Silas saw the foreman walk toward the wreckage. The man didn't look horrified. He looked relieved. He reached down and picked up a heavy ledger, tucking it under his arm to hide the maintenance reports that would have proven his negligence. He didn't see a human being under that iron. He saw an insurance claim he could lie his way out of. Silas blinked, and the scorching heat was replaced by the biting Pennsylvania chill. He was back in the dark, his flashlight rolling on the floor, its beam illuminating a pair of boots. Not modern work boots, but old, cracked leather brogues from a century ago. He looked up slowly. Standing before him was a figure draped in shadow, wearing the tattered remains of a 1920s jumpsuit. Where a face should have been, there was only a terrifying, concave darkness, a flattened mask of gray skin and shattered bone that seemed to absorb the light. The smashed face didn't move to strike. It simply stood there, a manifestation of 100 years of unspoken truth and unpunished greed. Silas realized then that the ghost wasn't a hunter of souls. It was a keeper of a terrible secret. The weight he felt on his shoulder wasn't an attack. It was a plea. The spirit was a witness to its own murder, trapped in a loop of betrayal that had never been set right. The moral of this haunting revelation was heavy with the weight of history. Truth has a way of outliving those who try to bury it, and a soul cannot find rest as long as a lie stands in the place of its legacy. Silas understood now that the trick played on him by Miller and Jacks was an echo of the betrayal Elias had suffered decades ago. The cycle was repeating, and he was the only one who could see the pattern. The ghost raised a trembling, translucent hand and pointed toward the floorboards beneath the foreman's desk. As Silas watched, the wood began to rot and peel away, revealing a hidden compartment that had been sealed for nearly a century. But as he stepped forward to investigate, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floor. The ghost's face suddenly contorted, and the temperature in the room dropped so low that the metal walls began to crack. The air in the foundry didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt pressurized, as if the oxygen were being squeezed out by the sheer weight of the spirit's presence. Silas stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the figure of Elias Thorne. The ghost's face, that concave, shadowed hollow where features should have been, seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, dull throb, matching the beat of Silas's own terrified heart. The ghost pointed once more at the rotted floorboards beneath the foreman's desk, its translucent finger trembling with a century of unvented rage. Silas dropped to his knees, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the edges of the wood. As he pulled at the damp, decaying planks, a thick, black liquid began to seep up through the cracks. It wasn't water. It was old, viscous machine oil, smelling of burnt hair and lightning. It pooled rapidly around his knees, forming a dark, shimmering mirror on the foundry floor. Silas hesitated, his gaze drawn down to the oily surface, and what he saw there made the blood turn to lead in his veins. In the reflection of the oil, Silas's face was no longer his own. As he watched, his reflection began to warp and sink inward. His nose seemed to flatten, his cheekbones spreading wide and jagged, and his eyes retreating into deep, dark pits. It was as if the oil were showing him his own face being crushed by an invisible 2-ton weight. He gasped, reaching up to touch his skin, terrified to find it soft and yielding, but his physical face felt whole. Only the reflection was being stolen, being reshaped into the likeness of the smashed-face ghost. The physical world began to react to the spirit's escalating grief. Above them, the massive iron chains that hung from the rafters started to swing in a violent, synchronized arc, clanging against the support beams with a sound like a funeral bell. The heavy hydraulic press, stone-cold for 80 years, began to hiss with spectral steam. The floorboards beneath Silas groaned and buckled, and for a moment, he felt a crushing pressure on his own skull, a phantom weight that threatened to flatten him into the very earth he stood upon. Desperate to break the connection, Silas plunged his hand into the dark oil and the gap in the floorboards. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, not the silver coins Miller had lied about, but a heavy, leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth. As soon as his hand closed around the book, the reflection in the oil shattered into 1,000 ripples. The phantom pressure on his head vanished, leaving him gasping for air on the cold floor, the ledger clutched tightly to his chest. The ghost of Elias let out a sound, not a scream, but a low, vibrating hum that shook the glass panes in the high windows. It stepped back into the deepest shadows of the office, its form flickering like a dying candle. It was as if the act of Silas retrieving the book had drained the spirit's immediate energy, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt like wool. Silas scrambled backward, away from the pool of oil, his heart still racing from the sight of his distorted reflection. The moral of this harrowing encounter was etched into Silas's mind. To truly help another, one must sometimes be willing to look into the darkest parts of their pain and see a bit of oneself reflected there. Empathy, he realized, was a heavy burden, and by taking the ledger, he had accepted a weight that went far beyond the physical world. He wasn't just a trespasser anymore. He was a participant in a tragedy that had never reached its final act. But the relief of the ghost's retreat was short-lived. From outside the foundry, Silas heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, the low rumble of an engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. He looked toward the small, cracked window. It wasn't the police and it wasn't a rescue party. It was Miller's truck, returning to the scene. But as the headlights swept across the building, Silas saw something that made him freeze. Miller and Jax weren't coming back to let him out. They were carrying a heavy chain and a fresh padlock. The twin beams of the truck's headlights cut through the dusty air of the foundry like two searching eyes, illuminating the swirling motes of iron dust and cobwebs. Silas pressed his face against the cold, grime-streaked glass of the office window, his breath hitching. For a fleeting second, a wave of relief washed over him. He thought they had come back to apologize, to laugh off the prank and take him home. But as the truck cut its engine and the doors creaked open, that relief curdled into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. Miller and Jax weren't laughing. In the pale moonlight, their faces looked haggard, twisted by a frantic, desperate energy. Miller wasn't holding a key. He was dragging a heavy industrial chain across the gravel, the links clinking with a sound like sharpening knives. Jax followed behind, his eyes darting toward the dark tree line as if something were chasing them. They didn't look like teenagers playing a joke. They looked like men trying to bury a body. "Hurry up," Jax hissed, his voice carrying through the cracks in the foundry walls. The old man said if we didn't leave a placeholder by midnight, the debt would fall on us. My granddad didn't lose his eye to this place just for us to let the shadow out. Silas felt the floor beneath him seem to tilt. The test of courage wasn't a hazing ritual. It was an offering. In the superstitious corners of Oakhaven, stories persisted that the smashed face required a living presence within the walls to keep the rest of the town safe from his restless wandering. They hadn't just tricked him. They had sacrificed him. Silas lunged for the door, screaming their names, his voice raw and cracking. He hammered on the steel plates until his knuckles bled. "Miller, Jax, open the door. I have the book. I know what happened." But his cries were swallowed by the vast, echoing chambers of the ironworks. Outside, the sound of the heavy chain being looped through the door handles and secured with a massive padlock rang out with a finality that felt like a death sentence. The truck engine roared back to life, the tires spitting gravel as they sped away, leaving Silas in a silence so profound it felt like he had been dropped into the bottom of a well. The air inside the foundry began to change almost immediately. Without the distant comfort of the truck's headlights, the darkness became absolute, save for the flickering, dying beam of Silas's flashlight. The smashed-face spirit, sensing the departure of the others and the sealing of the tomb, began to manifest with renewed intensity. The heavy ledger in Silas's hand felt like it was heating up, the old leather vibrating with a low-frequency hum that he could feel in his very marrow. The moral that sat heavy in the dark was a painful one. A man's worth is often measured by the company he keeps, and to give your trust to the untrustworthy is to build a house upon a foundation of shifting sand. Silas realized that his need for acceptance had blinded him to the rot in Miller and Jax's hearts. He was now alone with a ghost that had been betrayed by the ancestors of the very men who had just locked the door. Silas retreated into the foreman's office, the only place that felt even remotely like a shelter. He huddled under the desk, clutching the ledger to his chest. The thud-drag sound returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the catwalks. It was coming from the other side of the office door. The floorboards groaned under a weight that shouldn't exist, and the scent of burnt oil and old blood filled the small room. As Silas sat trembling, a small, rhythmic tapping started from inside the leather-bound ledger. It wasn't the wind or a trick of the mind. Something or someone was trying to communicate from within the pages of the hidden history. The tapping from within the ledger was rhythmic and persistent, like a heartbeat made of parchment and ink. Silas huddled in the knee-hole of the old oak desk, his own breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Outside the office door, the thud-drag sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the warmth right out of the room. Then, the floorboards in the hallway didn't just creak. They groaned under a weight that sounded like a falling mountain. Thud! The first step hit the threshold. The door, though locked, rattled in its frame as if an earthquake were localized entirely on the other side. Silas clutched the ledger so hard his fingernails dug into the old leather. He finally found the courage to open the book. His flashlight beam was dying, turning a sickly yellow, but it was enough to see the jagged, frantic handwriting of the foreman from 1928. The pages were filled with production numbers, but the margins were crowded with a single, repetitive sentence. "The face in the iron won't stop looking at me." Thud. The second step was closer. The wood of the door began to splinter inward, not from a blow, but from the sheer pressure of the presence behind it. Silas turned the pages of the ledger frantically. He found a folded piece of paper tucked near the back, a telegram that had never been sent. It was addressed to the widow of Elias Thorne. It confessed that the safety chains hadn't snapped. They had been intentionally thinned to save on maintenance costs, and the foreman had watched Elias walk into the trap. The truth wasn't just hidden. It was a confession of a crime that had been labeled an accident for a century. Thud. The third step was inside the room. The air grew so heavy Silas felt as though he were underwater. The smashed-face ghost didn't burst through the door. It simply seemed to manifest through the very atoms of the wood. The figure stood nearly 7 feet tall, its shoulders slumped with the weight of the iron it had died under. Its jumpsuit was stained with the black oil of the foundry, and its head was a horrific, distorted mass of shadow and flattened bone. It didn't have eyes, yet Silas felt a gaze so intense it burned his skin. The ghost raised a hand that looked like it had been forged in a furnace, and pointed directly at the ledger. Silas realized the tapping he had heard wasn't a message. It was a beckoning. The ghost wasn't there to take Silas's face. It was there because it could finally sense the evidence of its own betrayal being held by someone who could see the truth. The ghost moved closer, its footsteps vibrating in Silas's teeth, the sound like 2 massive stones grinding together. "I have it," Silas managed to choke out, holding the ledger up like a shield. "I have the telegram. I know what the foreman did. I know it wasn't an accident." The ghost froze. The rhythmic grinding sound stopped. For the first time, the oppressive weight in the room shifted. It didn't disappear, but it changed from a crushing force into a desperate, hollow longing. The spirit leaned forward, its concave face inches from the ledger, its translucent form flickering like a film reel about to snap. The moral that echoed through the dark was a somber one. Justice delayed is a weight that grows heavier with every passing year, and sometimes, the only thing a restless soul needs is a witness to the wrongs they endured. Silas saw that the monster of Oakhaven was merely a victim who had been denied his name and his story. But as he reached out to show the spirit the telegram, the ghost's form suddenly buckled. A new sound erupted from the main floor of the foundry, the high-pitched mechanical whine of a circular saw. Miller and Jax hadn't just left. They had returned with reinforcements. They weren't coming to save Silas. They were coming to destroy the evidence and the building once and for all. The high-pitched, metallic scream of a circular saw tore through the heavy silence of the foundry, vibrating through the brick walls and into Silas's very bones. Outside, the orange sparks of the saw began to bite into the chain and the padlock that Miller and Jax had so recently placed. They were coming back in, but the frantic speed of their work told Silas they weren't there to rescue him. They were there to sanitize the site. If the legend of the smashed face was getting too restless, their solution was to burn the evidence of their family's past and the witness along with it. Silas looked back at the ghost of Elias Thorne. The spirit remained frozen, its distorted, concave face hovering just inches from the telegram Silas held. In the flickering light of his dying flashlight, Silas didn't see a monster anymore. He saw a man whose life had been reduced to a footnote in a ledger, a man who had been flattened not just by iron, but by the indifference of those he worked for. "They're coming to destroy it, Elias," Silas whispered, his voice trembling but certain. "They want to erase what happened to you, just like they did 100 years ago." The spirit's reaction was subtle but profound. The aggressive, crushing pressure in the room began to ebb, replaced by a deep, resonant sadness. The ghost's form seemed to solidify, the gray, ash-like skin of its face twitching as if trying to form a mouth that no longer existed. A single heavy tear, thick and dark like machine oil, rolled down the spirit's cheek. For the first time, Silas felt a connection that wasn't born of fear, but of shared betrayal. He realized that the haunting was simply a soul screaming to be heard. With a sudden, violent thud, the exterior doors of the foundry gave way. The saw fell silent, replaced by the heavy tread of boots on the iron floor. Miller's voice echoed through the cavernous space, sounding more jagged than the saw. "I don't care if the kid's in there. Douse the central supports. If we take down the press and the office, the old man Elias won't have a place to sit anymore. My family's been paying for that foreman's mistake for 3 generations. Today, the debt is settled." Silas scrambled to his feet, tucking the ledger and the telegram securely into his jacket. He looked at the ghost, which was now looking toward the office door, its translucent chest heaving as if it were still trying to draw breath. "I won't let them," Silas said, looking the ghost in the eye. "I'll tell them the truth. I'll make sure everyone in Oakhaven knows your name wasn't just a ghost story." The spirit tilted its head, and for a fleeting second, the shadow over its face cleared, revealing the faint, ghostly outline of a man who just wanted to go home. The moral of this moment of recognition was a light in the dark. When we look past the scars and the shadows of others, we find a humanity that mirrors our own. For no soul is truly a monster once its story is finally understood. Silas had found a strange ally in the very thing he had feared most. He realized that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand for the truth even when the world was trying to burn it down. The office door was kicked open with a bang. Miller stood there, a red gasoline can in one hand and a heavy iron pipe in the other. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed on Silas, but he couldn't see the towering, silent figure of Elias Thorne standing right behind the boy. Miller stepped into the room, a cruel smirk forming on his face. "Give me the book, Silas, and maybe you'll make it out before the match is lit." The office was thick with the suffocating fumes of gasoline as Miller stepped further into the room. Behind him, Jax lingered in the doorway, his face pale and sweating, holding a flickering lighter. Miller's gaze was locked onto the leather-bound ledger in Silas's hand. To Miller, that book wasn't history. It was a liability. It was the proof that his family's local prominence was built on the blood and silence of a murdered man. "You don't understand how things work here, Silas," Miller sneered, tightening his grip on the iron pipe. "Oak Haven keeps its secrets buried for a reason. That ghost is just a story we use to keep people away from what belongs to us. Now, hand over the book, or you'll become part of the legend yourself." He took a menacing step forward, the iron pipe scraping against the floorboards with a screeching sound that mimicked the ghost's own grinding footsteps. Silas didn't flinch. He felt a strange, cold calm radiating from the shadow behind him. The ghost of Elias Thorne hadn't moved, but the air around him was beginning to vibrate with a low, subsonic hum. "It's not a story, Miller," Silas said, his voice steady. "His name was Elias. Your great-grandfather didn't just watch him die, he planned it. He sabotaged the safety chains for a bonus. I have the telegram. I have the proof." Silas held the ledger high, but he wasn't looking at Miller. He was looking at the reflection in the window. Miller lunged, swinging the iron pipe in a vicious arc toward Silas's head. But as the metal moved through the air, it suddenly slowed, as if passing through thick syrup. The temperature in the office plummeted to a bone-shattering sub-zero. The gasoline on the floor began to freeze, frost crawling across the puddles in jagged, crystalline patterns. Miller gasped, his breath coming out in a thick cloud, as he realized the pipe was being held by a hand he couldn't see. Then, Elias manifested. The ghost didn't attack Miller with violence. He attacked him with the truth. The spirit stepped out of the shadows and placed his hand, the heavy, cold slab of iron-like fingers, directly onto Miller's chest. Miller's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the ghost shared his final moments. Miller wasn't just seeing the ghost. He was feeling the weight of the 2-ton plate, the betrayal of the foreman, and the 100 years of loneliness that followed. "Look at him," Silas shouted over the sudden roar of phantom machinery. "Look at what your family did." The ghost's smashed face began to glow with a pale, ethereal light. The concave hollow of his features flickered, momentarily showing the face of the kind man from the photograph. The cycle of fear was breaking. The ghost wasn't a predator anymore, but a judge. Jax, terrified by the sight of Miller paralyzed and weeping in the grip of a shadow, dropped the lighter and fled into the dark of the foundry, his screams echoing through the halls. The moral of this confrontation was a powerful reckoning. True power does not lie in the ability to suppress the past, but in the courage to face it. For a lie can only survive as long as there is no one brave enough to speak the truth. Silas realized that by standing his ground, he had given the ghost the strength to move from a state of haunting to a state of witness. He was no longer a victim of a prank. He was the guardian of a soul's dignity. Miller collapsed to his knees, the iron pipe clattering to the floor. The ghost let go, his form beginning to dissolve into a soft, white mist. The heavy, oppressive weight that had defined the foundry for a century began to lift. But the building, weakened by decades of rot and the recent mechanical stress, began to groan. A support beam near the central press snapped with a sound like a thunderclap. The foundry was coming down. The foundry gave a final, agonizing shriek as the structural supports, weakened by a century of rust and the spiritual upheaval of the night, began to buckle. Clouds of soot and iron dust rained from the rafters. Silas grabbed Miller by the collar of his jacket, hauling him to his feet. Miller was catatonic, his eyes vacant and wet with tears, his spirit broken by the weight of the vision Elias had shared. "Move, Miller. It's over. We have to go." Silas roared over the sound of snapping timber. They stumbled out of the foreman's office just as the ceiling collapsed behind them, burying the desk and the pool of frozen gasoline under tons of brick. Silas clutched the ledger to his chest like a holy relic. As they ran toward the main doors, Silas looked back one last time. Standing amidst the falling debris was the silhouette of Elias Thorne. He wasn't distorted or terrifying anymore. He stood tall, bathed in a soft, flickering light, and for the first time Silas saw him nod. A slow, dignified gesture of gratitude, before the shadow of the great hydraulic press swallowed him whole. They burst through the gate and into the cool night air just as the main roof of the foundry groaned and caved in. A massive plume of dust billowed into the Pennsylvania sky, masking the moon for a fleeting moment. Silas and Miller collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to echo through the valley. Jax must have called for help from a nearby house, driven by a terror that would likely never leave him. The next morning, the sun rose over Oakhaven with a clarity it hadn't possessed in years. Silas didn't go home to hide. Instead, he sat on the steps of the town hall with the local newspaper reporter and the town's oldest archivist. He opened the ledger and laid out the telegram. He told them everything, not just about the haunting, but about the man named Elias who had been a father, a neighbor, and a victim of greed. By noon, the story of the smashed-face ghost had begun to transform. It was no longer a campfire tale to frighten children. It was a local tragedy that demanded a memorial. The site of the foundry was eventually cleared and turned into a small park. A bronze plaque was placed at the entrance, bearing the names of the men who had worked the iron, with Elias Thorne's name at the very top. Miller and his family, unable to face the town's gaze after the truth of the ledger went public, eventually moved away, their long-held influence evaporating like mist. Silas stayed, no longer the new kid or a flatlander, but a respected member of the community who had looked into the heart of Oakhaven's darkness and brought back the light. The moral of this final chapter is the cornerstone of all folklore. The stories we tell shape the world we live in. When we choose to tell the truth over a lie, we don't just lay the dead to rest. We allow the living to finally walk in peace. Silas learned that bravery isn't about fighting monsters, but about having the heart to see the person behind the mask. As the years passed, people still talked about the old foundry. They said that on quiet, foggy nights, you could still hear the faint ring of a hammer against iron. But the sound was no longer heavy or threatening. It was the steady, peaceful rhythm of a man finally at work in a place where he was remembered, respected, and at long last free.